Hello and welcome to the Colts Cover-2 Podcast. I'm Joel Erickson. I'm joined, as always, by Nate Atkins. Nate, it has been very quiet on the Colts front. That's not really that out of the ordinary for this time of year. They have already made their staff hires on the defensive side of the ball. Not seeing a ton of turnover there. You're just not. We're not following that kind of stuff the way we normally would be. We're not really to the point now where they're going to be talking about free agents yet. That stuff starts to ramp up around the combine. There are some moves made before that, but they're generally fairly minimal compared to the rest. This is one of the quieter parts of the NFL schedule, except for the fact that two other teams are playing for the league championship in a couple days. And so to that, I ask Nate, what is your favorite football watching snack?
I just like anytime there's like a very creative like bean dip that you can use with like tortilla chips or Fritos, that kind of thing. I feel like that's just kind of Super Bowl written all over it. So in place of that, when I'm lazy or when I'm not like at more of a Super Bowl party, I'll just get like either salsa or jalapeno cheese with that, but because I've never made my own bean dip, but like if my mom were to make it or my grandma were to make it, or I go to a Super Bowl party that has it, that's kind of what I'm getting first.
And if you do that, how many bags of tortilla chips do you eat?
I try to limit to just one. But yeah,
tortilla chips are nature's most like unassuming like binge food. Like I've had to stop eating them because if I start eating them, like have you looked at the portion sizes on tortilla chips? It's like 10 chips.
Oh yeah, no one does that.
No one eats 10 chips, especially if the dip's good.
Yeah, if you're going in, you're going for like half the bag. So they're very dangerous in that way. That's why it's like Super Bowls. They come once a year for a reason. We cannot handle more than that.
Yeah, I do not have self-control for tortilla chips. The last couple of years, I make a homemade ceviche, and I kind of like that for football games. It's just shrimp and avocado and lime juice and some other stuff. But yeah, I like that for football games.
It's much healthier than the chips and tortilla chip bean dip combination.
Well, some of us in this podcast are getting to the age where we have to think about stuff like how much protein we're intaking every day and that kind of thing. So
I try to watch it too, but it's a cheat day for us all. So
some of us are a little bit older than other members of the podcast. We'll let everybody out there guess who, and cannot eat the way they used to. Back when in college, you got a 20-inch pizza for like 4 of you for the Super Bowl.
Yeah, those are the days. I'm approaching the mid-30s. I think it was our last pod that we determined that I'm old because we found out that Tyler Higbee's younger than I am, and you thought that guy was really.
I didn't like that. I didn't appreciate that Tyler Higbee was a 9-year veteran. I don't appreciate that you brought it up right now. I don't feel great about it.
Yeah. We're on happy topics. We somehow went from a happy topic like snacks to very morbid ones like
that's what happens. That's what happens with getting older. Happy topics become sad because you can't eat them anymore or you'll get fat. That's what happens when you get older. Anyway, So this has been a unfortunately probably a slightly depressing opening of the podcast. We're going to be talking about Lou Anarumo, something that will matter for the Colts going into next year, the new defensive coordinator. Nate's been looking at film. I've been trying to learn as much as I can about Anarumo over the course of the last couple of weeks too. Let's just go with I know you're halfway through your film study. I feel like I'm not fully there yet either, but let's just go with what sticks out from what you've seen so far.
I mean, it's a lot of what you heard about him at the peak. I started with the peak, just watching film. I wanted to see the best version of him first, and then we'll get into later kind of how it fell apart in Cincinnati. But so I went back to the playoff games between the Bengals and the Bills, and then the two against the Chiefs. Those 3 games, Lou Anarumo's defense pretty well flummoxed Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes. Mahomes ended up having the second kind of rematch with him. Mahomes he got his number more, but wasn't like explosive. They still sacked him 3 times. The other 2 games against Allen and Mahomes were 2 of the worst that those 2 quarterbacks have ever played in the playoffs. And so I wanted to start there with Lou, kind of just to see the upside, and then to try to figure out like how much of this Colts roster can replicate it and where they need to add, because that's what the story of Lou Anarumo is. When he's had the pieces, it's been magnificent like that. When he hasn't, it's led to him being available for hire this past offseason. So the biggest thing to me was like what you hear is just how creative he is and how much of the approaches start kind of back to front, where a lot of defenses are not built that way. Like the older school defenses, that includes just defensive models, including the 2 that Chris Ballard has had here in Indianapolis, Matt Eberflus and Gus Bradley. Those are built from the middle out, meaning that like their concepts start at the linebacker level. Those were linebacker coaches by trade. They have been in the league for decades as linebacker coaches. And so they build this more in like a front 7 type of mindset. In coverage tends to be a little bit more secondary, and that's the way that Chris Ballard has built the defense out as a roster. But Lou Anarumo, it's more from the back front, and it really is all about those 2 safeties, I think, kind of hold the keys to everything. So when he had Jesse Bates, an all-pro, when he had Von Bell, who was a trusted veteran they'd signed from the Saints to round this out, they could just do a ton of different things. And so that let them mix the coverages up a ton. They, I had seen a coverage map, let's see, from just a couple of years ago on them. And, these, like they use every coverage like to a decent level. There's none that they just ignore, and there's none that they just lean on. So that's different from Gus Bradley, who's, very heavy cover 3. So the reason that it changes up so much for Lou Anarumo is when he has 2 good safeties like that, that's where you can rotate from a safety in the middle of the field, which was Jesse Bates often, but sometimes they would switch it and it would be Von Bell, to 2 high safeties. They would do that. So that'd be more your cover 2, cover 4, cover 6. And just fascinating the way that they interchange those 2, where Jesse Bates by his best skill is sort of that free ranging guy in the back end, but they would also use him a ton in man coverage. And then they would sometimes show looks like he's in man coverage and bring the blitz. And then they would do that sometimes with Von Bell. And that's what we talked a lot about the pod kind of right when Aaron was hired about what needs to be different here. And it's making that post snap picture look different than the pre-snap picture, because if it's not, life's too easy on these quarterbacks who have all the physical skills. And then they also now have, in the AFC, have the experience levels to be able to win against that. And when they know where your defenders are going to be, their plays are going to beat your plays. They know what they're running. You're guessing as to what they're running. You're reacting to what they're running. That's kind of been the limitation of the Colts defense recently that I think Lou Anarumo is here to solve. That's where, like, as we go through this, I think it'd be interesting today for today's pod to kind of go through the different positions that the Colts have and how they fit into this. There's a lot of pieces of that Bengals defense that I think are here in some form or fashion already. Maybe lesser versions of it, but or maybe less developed. But like you think about, like, DJ Reader was such a big key nose tackle for the Bengals. Well, they've got Grover Stewart here. Trey Hendrickson was the star edge rusher. They're trying to build Leatu Latu into that. Logan Wilson was sort of your classic thumper middle linebacker. Well, you got Zaire Franklin, has been that and led the league in tackles. The thing that's missing right now is the safety play. And so I'm fascinated to see how the Colts go about replicating that so that they can give Lou the opportunity to vary those coverage looks up, rotate them, just before the snap, or, blitz guys from depth or blitz them out of man looks, all this type of stuff that we haven't really seen here as much. And the stuff that Lou wasn't able to do nearly as much once the Bengals let Jesse Bates walk. And I think that was a big part of when things started to fall apart for the Bengals. So that's kind of the thing that jumped out to me most off the bat, was just how interesting and creative the safeties are and the safety play is. And it's the one other coordinator that always strikes me as doing this type of thing is Steve Spagnuolo, which is why the Chiefs always go after a high level safety, whether it's Justin Reid or Tyrann Mathieu. So that just seems to be like the central position to making this thing really work.
What are your thoughts on Nick Cross going forward? Julian Blackmon's a free agent. I think both of us have already said on this pod, we'll probably get back to this in free agency, but I think we both lean towards his availability issues make him maybe a backstop to me if you strike out elsewhere. But what are your thoughts on Nick Cross after a season that statistically looks like the counting statistics look pretty good, but obviously we know now that this is 2024. We know the counting statistics aren't everything.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about with the safety deal, and I think there's flashes of Von Bell in him stylistically. The fact that there is versatility to Nick Cross's game now that he started as a strong safety and as a free safety. He's cross-trained as a nickel and even a dime linebacker if they had to do that in a pinch. So there's a world where I think they're kind of similar. I think Nick Cross, his best trait is his tackling, which is not something you would have said about many members of last year's Colts defense. But I think Nick Cross came a long way there, and you see he's just built like a freight train physically, and so he's built a little bit more like that strong safety. But he's played. Last year he started out at free safety and then moved down to strong safety when Julian Blackmon got hurt. So in theory, you'd love for him to be more of your in the box strong safety who can at times rotate and be that free safety since he has the range and he has some of that experience. One thing it's harder for us to know, and maybe some of it we have to see play out since he's only been a full-time starter for 1 year, is how much can he take on as a communicator? How many of these coverages, just where is he at in his experience level, seeing things pre-snap and playing creatively within that? The Colts were very limited in what they did at safety, partly because Julian Blackmon was hurt, so they turned him just into a free safety, partly because it didn't always work on that level with Nick. Right when he came in, that was not working for him. Now he came in at 20 years old, so now he's going to go into his fourth season. So I think I like Nick in this type of defense if they have that other safety who's like better than he is, more experienced than he is, more of that frontline guy. So something closer. It's really hard to get a Jesse Bates, something closer to that type of. That guy's going to engineer. And if Nick Cross is your number two safety who can, and both of them are versatile to play free safety and strong safety, I think he can fit in really well. What I would guard against, though, is making, just either bringing back Julian Blackmon or finding a replacement to him that's not an upgrade to where I don't think it's Nick Cross is ready to be your number one safety. And I think if he's engineering this picture, it's not going to be as strong as if he's sort of a playmaking element within it.
Yeah, the thing that stuck out to me is, I think if you keep him around the line of scrimmage more, I know the previous coaching staff felt that the more you kept him around the line of scrimmage, the better he was. But like some of his coverage stats from Pro Football Reference, 109.9 rating on throws against him, 8.6 yards per target, 71.2% completions. Obviously, we've all talked about the issues in the middle of the field. Now, I don't think it's going to be taught the same way in Anarumo's defense in terms of how they cover those shorter routes. And so I think I'll be interested to find out if a more aggressive Nick Cross in coverage is a better Nick Cross. But I do think that there are some Von Bell tendencies to him as long as you keep him in that strong. And like you said, he can't be the number one. I don't think we're ready for him to be the number one where he's the one doing everything. And also, he's been better as a strong safety in the NFL.
Yeah.
His free safety snaps were sometimes littered with mistakes that led to big plays and touchdowns. So I kind of feel the same way you do. I'm with you. I think that that free safety spot, they need a real player there.
Well, and Von Bell's an interesting comparison because he wasn't quite up to task last season to be the top safety either. And that's a guy who's in his 9th season. Nick Cross is entering his 4th season and really his 2nd season as a starter. So it's just not, it's too early. It's one of the hardest positions. I mean, you're asking that top safety in this type of defense needs to be able to do everything, not just physically, but mentally and engineered as a vocal leader. Everything you hear about Jesse Bates is that. Why it was crippling for the Bengals to let him walk. And then, they just tried to replace it with kind of like much, much lower investments that they thought were veterans, but weren't enough. But the thing is, Von Bell wasn't ready for this. And Von Bell, I mean, it came in very similar pedigree. Von Bell's a 2nd-round pick, but he had to started some in New Orleans. Actually, it was full-time starter his first year there. But yeah, I don't think Nick Cross is ready for that. But
yeah,
that's what's going to be tough is finding one.
I covered Vaughn in New Orleans, and some of the stuff that we've said about Nick Cross the last couple of years is stuff that we said about Vaughn when he was in New Orleans. So I do think that there are some parallels there in terms of just the way they came into the league, that kind of thing. He functioned better once Dennis Allen really got the defense going and put him in more of an attack role than a coverage type role. There's some definite, I think, links there between young Von Bell and young Nick Cross. Cornerback is interesting to me too, just because you mentioned earlier, I can't remember if you mentioned him or not, but obviously Kenny Moore is Mike Hinton. And so they have the slot, the blitzing slot that they want. One of the things I noticed is just the cornerbacks with Anarumo's defense, they either seem to be in press or closing on short routes a lot more and faster than we've seen with Gus Bradley's corners in the past. And that to me is really interesting going forward. Just, how does that work? Because Jalen Jones, it feels like Jalen Jones is better on the short stuff than he is the long stuff. I could be wrong. It's been a month since the season. But I always felt like he was susceptible and guys could get deep on him. We don't really know with Juju Brents what he is at this point. I think, both of us would say that they need guys there, but the profile of playing press, playing at the line, but not just doing that, being able to close on guys on the outside, I think is a big deal. There has to be an aggression to a Lou Anarumo corner that we haven't always seen from Bradley's corners.
Yeah, that's the thing is they switch up these coverages so much they need guys who are athletically built to do that. So Jalen Jones and Juju Brents were drafted for a very specific type of outside cornerback. That Seattle-style hulking outside corner is going to play primarily cover 3 and do a lot of, when they would play press, it was more about funneling those receivers into the middle of the defense, into the single high safety, not so much to press and play man the same way that they will, that the Lou Anarumo's group would do. He does tend to go for very athletic gambling type outside corners. So Eli Apple is the classic, moments that he really well and moments that are just utterly chaotic and terrible. And they're willing to live that way though, because those safeties are so dang good. And that's what I think wasn't part of the limitations of Gus Bradley's system was also the personnel was not there when they didn't even know Nick Cross was going to be their starter until the last week of the preseason. And then Julian Blackmon, there's just the issue with the injuries, and that happened within 1 week. It was they didn't have the available safety, the built-up safeties to do a lot more than they were going to do anyway. And then it isn't in the skill sets of, I mean, Juju barely played last year, but it isn't in the skill set of Jalen Jones to play man as much, down the field, across the field. He's a short area guy because of his physicality. And so those are two spots that don't, like, they just don't fit as well with what Lou has done in the past. Now, any good coach is going to, adjust his scheme to the players that he inherits. And so I think there's roles for those guys here, but that's where I think they definitely need to add at least one starting outside cornerback. I don't think they should just roll in and force those guys into the system. But whereas those guys don't necessarily fit the best right now, I think Kenny Moore is about as perfect of a fit as you're going to find. Of all positions on this defense, that's the guy that just is going to be dropped in, and he is Mike Hilton in the way that he's going to be used here, which I've been wanting for years for him to blitz more. Though it's something Matt Eberflus did more with him, and it hasn't been as much of a fit under Gus Bradley. The nickel was not as primary of a role. It's a more primary role in this Lou Anarumo defense that's built back to front. And yeah, it's very interesting how he used Mike Hilton, because he would they would do press man with him. They would blitz him both from those press man looks, but also from depth, and use his just long speed to get into the face of the quarterback. That was a big way that they tripped up Josh Allen in that playoff game was Mike Hilton blitzing from depth. Again, something they're able to do when they have good safety play behind that. And then where Mike Hilton really, really, really helped the Bengals was as a tackler, both in tackling underneath when they'd force you to throw underneath in zone coverage. He could do that on tight ends, and he could match up on tight ends where even if the tight end caught the pass, he would make the tackle. It wasn't a lot of yak he'd give up. And then where it really I noticed helped out is like in the red zone, the Bengals would often just play their nickel defense in the red zone, and teams would try and run at them. And between DJ Reader eating two blockers in the middle, Mike Hilton, the tackling from that nickel, that's different than what most teams are going to be able to present in nickel. That's the best version of Kenny Moore. I felt like last year Kenny slipped a little bit as a tackler because he was on the field so much, and it just added up and took a toll, and it wasn't built to be as consistent because he had to be out there and do it all the time. So that's something they have to fix. But from the skill set of the way Kenny can match up, as a tackler in the run game, in zone coverage, as a blitzer, all of that is really, really nice. The one difference, I guess, I think Mike Hilton may be a little bit better as a man cover corner. But also he's less versatile, whereas Kenny can bounce to the outside. They didn't really do that as much with Hilton. But yeah, that's the one where like Kenny Moore is about as perfect of a fit for this defense as you could have.
Yeah, I look forward to the return of 5-minute sessions on the post-game pods where I just break down a nickel's pass rush moves. Because Kenny has them. Yeah. Kenny has specific pass rush moves that he's worked on for years, tailored to his size and his ability, and they are fun. I look forward to that. From a linebacker standpoint, you mentioned they've got the Logan Wilson. We've talked about they don't have Jermaine Pratt. What is it about Pratt's game that stands out to you as you're watching film?
He is pretty good in coverage, both man and zone, and he also is pretty solid as a blitzer. So he's got this sort of versatile skill set. Where Jermaine Pratt slipped up was his tackling got worse over the years, and so and more got put on him with the drop of the safety play. So that's a similar issue that ate the Colts up last year. But they were able to use Jermaine Pratt and Logan Wilson better as blitzers, sometimes in sometimes creative ways. Sometimes they'd double blitz the A gap. Sometimes they would send them off the edges. They would simulate pressures where they drop a defensive end into coverage, replace him as a pass rusher with one of those blitzers, and they're pretty good at it. They just seem pretty well. It seemed like they were coached really well at timing that up or disguising it. So that helped out. They put less on these linebackers in coverage because, again, those safeties made it a different thing. So these guys were more your just drop zone type cover linebackers, whereas like Gus Bradley's system was about more that the man match principles, and you needed linebackers were supposed to be able to cover, and then the ones here couldn't do that. But the main thing is Jermaine Pratt offers something on third down that's very valuable, which is he can either blitz or he can drop into zone. And obviously those traits help, but also so does the ability to disguise them and make you guess which of those two he's going to do. That's what they need more of, because EJ Speed was not a skill set of his last year, didn't play into being a strength of his. And then if you look at a guy like Jalen Carlies, his skill set, what we know of him so far is that he was a converted safety. So he's got some of those coverage traits, and I think his tackling form is pretty good, but he's not built to defend the run nearly the same way. So he's more of like a down specific type of player. Jermaine Pratt was more of a guy that they could play 3 downs, and that's something that could be valuable for them, or at least a guy who can do that more of that than what they have right now.
He was there a really long time, too. That's one of the other things that sticks out to me. That Bengals defense had changed a lot since 2019. Pratt has been there a while.
Yep.
He's one of the few guys that I think got to be with Anarumo for a very long time. Probably speaks to what Anarumo values in that position and that spot. Obviously, the Colts still kind of trying to find their next weak side linebacker after, injuries ended Shaq Leonard's career. That's who was supposed to be the weak side linebacker here. But, that's a position that they're going to have to find something for. From a front standpoint, is it fair to say that they two-gap a little more than the attack front type stuff?
Yeah, it's definitely more of that. They'll do some creative stuff. They'll do some stunts. They'll drop their defensive linemen into coverage more. The Colts tried that a little bit in the middle of the season, but it felt a little just experimental, not something.
It's not Gus's game. Yeah,
it's not something that they had really.
It's not Gus's game
very well. It is Lou Anarumo's game, so that was a cool thing they would do with Trey Hendrickson sometimes. But yeah, they would two gap, and part of that was having DJ Reader is one of the best nose tackles in the league. Well, you've got Grover Stewart here can do much of the same thing. The interesting thing I thought with how they did the fronts and there was they would find different ways to create the one-on-one matchups based on the numbers. So there's sometimes they would do the diamond front where they 5 defensive linemen, and so you would have to do one-on-one matchups with DJ Reader, and he would win a lot of those. They would double blitz the A gap to where you can either you leave a blitzer just totally free, or you're having to you're leaving DJ Reader one-on-one. So that's the kind of stuff that I think that that while it's two gapping, they would find opportunities when they'd find maybe an overwhelmed or like undersized center to get DJ Reader into a one-on-one matchup. And then that brought something to the pass rush too, where he wasn't necessarily the guy getting to the quarterback, but he was moving him off his spots and making him redirect to the edge where he would run into, Trey Hendrickson or Sam Hubbard. I think it's a good way that they got Trey Hendrickson unleashed as kind of your wide rushing defensive end. And then we push quarterbacks into that with either the blitz or with DJ Reader. So what's interesting here is the one piece that the Colts have on defense that is way better than Lou Anarumo has ever had is the 3 technique. Is DeForest Buckner. Lou Anarumo had BJ Hill, who was a pretty solid player at that spot, fit the defense, but was not a star. DeForest Buckner is the star, and to have him next to Grover Stewart is fun when they can do some of this stuff to get into the one-on-one matchups. It's also something Lou brought up was that him playing next to Latu is very interesting to him because he's never had that for Trey Hendrickson. They've had to kind of do all this work to get Trey, with either stunts or, simulated pressures and stuff to get Trey a little bit better opportunities. So I'll be curious to see what he does with DeForest Buckner specifically next to next to Latu and Grover Stewart and see how that goes.
Yeah. What about when they get Myles Garrett?
Be pretty fun. Myles Garrett next to DeForest Buckner. Good luck.
Neither of us, for those of you listening, if you're mad at us for laughing at that, neither of us think that the Colts are players for Myles Garrett for one very simple reason. Myles Garrett very much wants to win. In fact, I thought there's a really interesting interview that he did with Rich Eisen yesterday, where he basically said he had conversations with Cleveland's front office about what their plan was going forward, and he didn't like what he heard. It sounded like the Browns told him that they thought it was going to take some time to get things going again. And Garrett's like, well, he's in year 9, headed into year 9. Garrett's like, I don't have that time. I've been doing that for 8 years. I don't want to do it again. The Colts aren't in that spot. They're just not. And they're not in that spot for one simple reason, at least from my perspective. They don't have a quarterback. I mean, they have quarterbacks on the roster, but they don't know that they have a quarterback, which is obviously the Browns' biggest problem as well. So I think that Garrett probably doesn't want to come here. And while he doesn't have a no-trade clause, you brought this up the other day, there's a part of his contract that kind of works as a no-trade clause.
Yeah, he's got 2 years left on the deal, but he's looking to find the next home, which means signing the extension that's going to be a monster extension. And so that's how this can end up playing out. This happened with Matthew Stafford, where I don't know if he had no trade clause, but it was the same deal where you weren't going to give up, a first round plus for a guy that was going to leave in 2 years. Now, I guess a team could talk themselves into doing that for Myles Garrett if they have a 2-year window, but the way the bidding war is going to work, it's probably not going to go that way. So Myles is going to, or maybe he shows up and he requests a trade from that team. I don't know. He's one of those guys who's enough of a superstar to pull his weight on this type of stuff. And so that's what he'll do. I will say that, if they're, just now that we're on the topic of this crazy hypothetical, and I wrote about for the mailbags, it's a little fresh in mind. If there was ever one position that Chris Ballard would go all in for, if that ever were to happen, I do think edge rusher is it. And we saw a glimpse of that last year with Danielle Hunter. But again, there's levels to this. Danielle Hunter they were offering a 2-year deal, I think, for $46 million. That's not going to be as much as what Myles Garrett will sign for over 4 years. But on top of that, it's all you're giving up, at minimum, you'd have to think 1 first-round pick, other picks, and then doing that. And so, it's not crazy. It's not absolutely crazy in the sense of would the Colts be interested in that type of player? Yeah, they would. But they also, because everyone would, and it fits how they build their team, but also they were hoping to enter this year in a spot where they felt great about their quarterback. And if they did, maybe they'd have a shot at him. But I think the main thing that Myles Garrett is showing that he wants is a veteran quarterback. The Browns have the number 2 pick, so they can draft one, and that's where it's developmental and weight. That's the whole story of Anthony Richardson is we're still got to develop him. We got to see if he can get on the field, stay on the field, all this stuff. So yeah, I think it's going to end up being a short list for teams that are actually in the Myles Garrett sweepstakes.
Yeah, he wants a quarterback that he wants to know what's going on there. He wants to have something proven there. It's interesting, you mentioned the contract. In basketball and baseball, we have these examples of teams being we might only have this guy for 1 year. We're going to take him on. We're fine with that. It doesn't happen really as much in football. And I think the big reason why is that the contracts aren't guaranteed. So guys are always searching for that next extension a couple years early, whereas in baseball, in basketball, there are some pretty clear reasons sometimes not to sign the extension. Baseball especially, if you get to the last year before free agency, it's a terrible idea if you're a superstar player to sign an extension at that point. So but that's different though, because the contracts aren't guaranteed. Where in the NFL, the way it works is you're trying to get as much of that money up front as fast as possible, because you know the back end of it, they'll be out.
Yeah, I'd also think with basketball, there's just more of a feeling that like one player can transform a situation better because it's one of 5 starters, or if it's the real superstars like a LeBron, it feels like more than that. For as great as Myles Garrett is, he isn't going to just turn a team into a contender, because if he could, he would be doing that in Cleveland right now.
He can't Kawhi Leonard you in Toronto.
Yeah, exactly. And they know, and he knows that too, which is the whole reason he's having this conversation. Is like, it's not going to be enough in his eyes to have the Browns draft a talented but raw quarterback at number 2, and then he's going to like drag that team through the AFC. I think the AFC North probably factors into that. The AFC, where the bar is so dang high at the quarterback position, and so that's the other thing too. Is like, if you envision a world where this trade somehow went down and the Colts were to give up, they sent all their picks out or whatever they needed to get Myles Garrett, he probably gets them a division title, because that's been winnable and out there, and they've been within a couple games. But unless they really take a gigantic leap forward at quarterback, it doesn't get him any closer to the real goal, which he said is winning a Super Bowl.
And we have a great example of that in the AFC South from not that long ago. JJ Watt.
Yeah.
Like, it would be hard to be more dominant than JJ Watt was in his heyday. And he tried his damnedest to drag those Texans teams somewhere other than the divisional round. And never really, you can't do it. You have to spend half the game watching somebody else keep your fate in your hands.
It's even hard for a quarterback to do that in this sport, because Joe Burrow did not make the playoffs this year, so it really does take a few different elements to make it happen. So it's kind of crazy, because the Browns were one of the teams that seemed to be heading in that direction. They had a few of those elements with Myles Garrett and Denzel Ward, the number 1 defense last year, and then Nick Chubb when he was humming. Then Chubb gets hurt, and then the quarterback position sinks them in. And so it's like, quarterback's one thing you have to have a chance, but you also have to have more than just that, or else you're the only
thing. Yeah, it can't be the only thing. Which is why the Lou Anarumo hire, like, there's a lot of people right now who are like, well, it doesn't matter what the Colts do in any other position unless they have the quarterback. And to some extent, that's true. Like, to some extent, that's 1,000% true. There's a huge ceiling for a team, a hard ceiling, especially in the AFC, like we detailed last week, for a team that doesn't have a quarterback. But you still keep building the defense, that if you do hit it with that quarterback, you don't have something holding you back the way, the defense held the Bengals back this year.
Yeah, and I think it will just be a supporting element to trying to answer that big question at quarterback. Like, if the Colts could build a top half of the league defense, less would fall on the shoulders of the quarterback. Maybe less falls on the shoulders of Shane Steichen's urge to get the explosive plays. If he's not chasing points and answering scores, they're off the field. If they can get off the field quicker, that can let the Colts kind of build their identity out a little bit better as a team that's going to win largely through the run game. And then say Anthony Richardson takes a pretty good step next year to the level where, like, you want to keep him, but it's just incremental. A really good defense can help you get to the playoffs, and then a game or two of playoff experience for a young quarterback is very big in terms of building him into what he's going to be. You think about, like, as great as Jaden Daniels is, as great as he looks like he is right now, it's very valuable for him to get that time in the playoffs, so that next year, if the Commanders, like, they have a shot at the Super Bowl, because it's not going to be their first time doing it. And Patrick Mahomes' first trip to the playoffs, they didn't get to the Super Bowl, but then the next year they did. And so that's kind of the way you want to build this out. It's not just, ultimately, it's never going to work. Nothing's going to end up mattering if the quarterback doesn't come together. But also, you want to set it up to where, hey, what if it actually does? And what if Anthony Richardson in a year and a half, 2 years does hit much more of the ceiling that he has that we haven't seen? What if he is able to stay on the field? Now you have the defense to go with it. Like that's where like the upside of your team becomes a lot higher, where not everything else could theoretically be there. You have the run game with Jonathan Taylor, 3 800-yard receivers. The Colts, I believe, Mike Chappell tweeted out, have only done that one other time ever. Offensive line's pretty solid. Obviously, we know they have certain positions they absolutely need, but that's a lot of this conversation with Lou Anarumo and the defense is getting them there. You want to set this up to where, like, especially going into next year, there need to be no more excuses for the quarterback. He's either going to be good enough or not, which means the rest of the roster has to be enough intact to where you're not talking about, like, are you setting this kid up to fail? He needs to be set up to succeed, and then if he doesn't succeed, then you have your answer, and you know where to go from there.
Yep. Anything else on Lou Anarumo's defense? Fairly short pod, but this is the time of year where the pods are tough to get long.
Yeah, it's interesting that he brought in hired two assistants, the linebackers coach James Betcher and the secondary coach Chris Hewitt. Decided to keep the defensive line coach Charlie Partridge. Found that interesting because the Colts were clearly open-minded to a defensive overhaul. They did this search a lot differently than they've done in the past. They very much, by the sounds of it, let Shane Steichen go for, let him drive this more than Chris Ballard. And then Lou Anarumo is coming in and he hires one coach in the secondary from the AFC North that he's probably gotten to know that way, and Chris Hewitt, who's stylistically similar to how he uses his corners, a linebackers coach he's worked with, but he chose to keep the defensive line coach he's never worked with and inherited, even though they just kind of had an average year last year. And I think that shows you that, like, there's a shared philosophy there in terms of, like, I think Lou likes to play a lot of guys up front. They will rotate a good amount. The other thing that I think really was underrated with the Bengals is, like, they would always have a number 3 rusher that would come in and play off of Trey Hendrickson and create some issues. Joseph Osai was that guy for them. That's where, like, theoretically there's some stuff that works here. In theory, I'm just curious to see how they build it out, because that defensive line, that whole approach, everything was put on that unit last year, and it didn't carry. It couldn't overcome the linebacker play and the secondary shortages. So if they get this to a point where they do get that difference-making safety, a linebacker who can cover, quarterbacks on the outside who are a little bit more athletic, like, do we see the upside of that defensive line? And then how do they end up building that out? That's a group that I think roster-wise is very interesting to watch, because you've got, like, Samson Ebukam coming off the Achilles tear. They could get out of that contract. Maybe they roll with it. Dio Dengbo is a free agent. That's a guy where I think as an edge setter fits a lot of what Lou wants to do, but he's going to have options in free agency. And then, trying to tap into the edge play of getting Kwity Paye and Laiatu Latu to, like, actually be that dynamic tandem. It's sort of like, while this defense is built back to front, in doing that and in shifting the philosophies there, I wonder if that can bring out the upside, the vision that Charlie Partridge had for the defensive line that just, for a lot of people's faults last year, didn't come together.
Yeah. I still think they're still fairly deep on the defensive line. If you lose Dio, if you move on from Ebukam, coming back off that Achilles, Colts fans are well aware that when you bring a player back off the Achilles, that it might not go well. There's still some additions that need to be made there, potential subtractions. But yeah, you would still hope that the defensive line is able to play at a good level. It's a defense that the more we look at it, the more we talk about it, I'm like, they could add 6 to 7 players to 8 players to 9 players, and I probably wouldn't be upset. It's some through the draft, some through free agency, but there's a lot of spots where they could use some help and some actual competition, not depth, not Ballard's version of competition where it's just depth, actual competition, guys who can take people's jobs.
Yeah, I think there's outside corner. cover linebacker. There's rotational spots on the defensive line. And then, the big one is the free safety. And that's where I think one of those positions needs to be like a dude, like not just a starter, like a real dude who can be a big piece. It's like they feel like they're one of these key pieces away. Maybe DeForest Buckner helps make up for that. But philosophically, when they build it back to front, you need one more dude in that secondary. It can't, if it's just Kenny Moore, I just think teams are going to find ways around that in ways that, when Mike Hilton was hitting his stride, it was because you had Jesse Bates in the back end, you had Von Bell, you had enough glue pieces around him where you could play the nickel. So
the corners weren't spectacular either, but like the 2021 and 2022 Bengals had like Awuzie and some other like veteran types who were going to give you a certain level of play.
Yeah. Yeah, at least they would have, like, even in the case of like Eli Apple, they would trade some really bad plays for like good moments too. They had that athletic capability of playing in a gambling way, whereas like I feel like everything about the way the Colts have built the roster, the way they've coached it at cornerback for a few years now, has been about like, let's just try and survive these quarterbacks we're going up against. Whereas like the aggressiveness is with Lou Anarumo, it's yes, he will blitz some more, but it's not. This isn't going to just be Wink Martindale type blitz all the time. This is still like the aggressiveness is more like the way you play your corners, the way you rotate your safeties, and they've got to have guys who are physically capable of doing that.
Yeah, I think that's the other thing is like you mentioned just trying to survive the quarterbacks. Lou Anarumo doesn't want to do that. He wants to make life difficult on them. He wants to make life hard on them. He wants to take away their best player. That's a big part of what he does is taking away their best player, trying to make them play left-handed, sort of the Bill Belichick way of playing defense where it's like, we're not going to let this guy – we're just not going to let this guy beat us. They have to find a different way for that. They have to find a different way to beat us. That's the stuff that he wants to take the fight to the quarterback as opposed to just, trying to limit the damage. And you need players to do that. You have to.
Yeah, and we've talked about this before, but even like with blitzing, it's not just a want-to thing. Like you have to have guys who are pretty good at that. And the two linebackers they had in Cincinnati, Logan Wilson, Jermaine Pratt, were pretty good at it. The two we saw here last year, not so much. The safeties were both really good at it. In Cincinnati, the ones here, I think it could be something in Nick Cross's skill set, but overall they're not there in those areas. So like if they add that stuff and then you've got DeForest Buckner dropped into this whole picture, there is upside here for this to be really cool. What's just so interesting about Lou Anarumo is we've just seen two extremes of it where the high end is this really taking the fight to these superstar quarterbacks in big stages and looking
confusing the
hell out of them. The low side of it is when you don't have those same players at those key positions on the back end, you just kind of become a mash unit and you're losing shootouts and that's what ended up getting him axed in Cincinnati. So they've got a choice this offseason based on how they build the roster of how much do they want to give him. And that's going to be the great unknown until we get to March.
For the Colts Cover-2 Podcast, I'm Joel Erickson. This is Nate Atkins. Enjoy whatever you're eating for the Super Bowl. Do not feel the guilt that some of us on the podcast, again, we're not going to say who they are, feel. Enjoy a Super Bowl. And then once the Super Bowl's over, the Combine is really not that far away. So it's slow right now, but it will speed up. This has been the Colts Cover-2 Podcast. We'll be back next week. Enjoy Sunday.